one of the major themes that he explores in that book, like how religion was used as a tool of colonialism. So it was that, and it was also the fact that my grandmother was a deeply religious woman, and she also got caught up in this whole like pastors, these or like not TV Joshua, but you know those guys. I think those guys. So and it ended up ending, and I'm not gonna recount the exact story, but it ended in tragedy for her. So I think that I was inspired by that. I was like, on the one hand, religion, I can see why religion is valuable for people. I can see the value in spirituality, but at the same time, there's a lot of harm that has been done in the name of religion. And it's so difficult to have these conversations. The second you say this, people interpret it as you attacking their religious beliefs. But I think that it is important to talk about how religion can be used in harmful ways, because especially in a country like this where the vast majority of people are religious, and religion has a massive impact on people's day-to-day lives. And particularly with people like Solomon, these like pastors who are, like, I just got really disgusted with how many of these pastors have very poor congregants, but they make so much money. They drive these expensive cars, they live in these massive houses. Meanwhile, their congregants are like people who are giving their last 5 rand. So I really wanted to, I thought it was important to write about this. And sometimes it's difficult to, I think there's a Toni Morrison quote that I can't remember exactly, but it's something along the lines of, things that are difficult to talk about, you put them in a story. So it was one of those things for me.
I think that something else that you've explored is familial relationships, but I'm particularly interested in the ways in which you wrote difficult relationships between mothers and daughters. I think that just in common conversations, we've almost accepted difficult relationships with fathers, just by nature of how so many fathers have behaved and continue to behave. But
questions that I distinctly remember having about religion when I was a kid. But also what's always struck me about her is that she has these powers and they're cool, but they're also a burden. Mm-hmm. And how does that burden end up impacting her, right? Which is why I ended the book the way that I did. It's very difficult to talk without spoiling. I'm not spoiling though. But which is why I ended the book the way that I did, because I wanted to acknowledge that these are a burden in some way. And they do force her to grow up very quickly. But I wanted her to retain that childlike innocence of her. I wanted her to be as normal a kid as she possibly could be, given the circumstances. And I wanted to portray her as this person who's deeply empathetic, who wants to help people, but like as a child who's in a very exploitative situation, there's only so much she can do.
Okay, I think that before Naledi spoils anything, I think we should stop there. Naledi, you can obviously see how much we've enjoyed your book. We will have an in-depth spoiler conversation later on, and then people can listen to that at their leisure. But thank you for writing Invisible Strings. I was telling Alma when I read, I was like, so I have this rule, like I have a reading practice of reading 50 pages a day. And I was like, okay, I'm only going to read 50 pages today. And then I phoned her and I'm like, I'm done. And she's like, why? And I'm like, the writing was so nice, right? The story was so nice. I think we often don't talk to writers about like how well they write. Like the story was written in such a way that I wanted to know more. Like I was like, okay, I'm going to stop here tonight. But then I was like, okay, no, maybe if I read another 20 pages. And so kudos for that, right? Kudos for writing a story that isn't labored, right? A story that like draws you in such a way that you actually want to know, until you got to the end and you're like, I wish I didn't get here so quickly. So thank you very much for that. Invisible Strings, I think, is going to, I'm hoping it becomes a movie. I think it deserves to be one. So if there are any movie people, Naledi is ready. Okay. What's next for you, Naledi?
Everyone keeps asking me this.
Apart from writing Mulefe's story, what's next?
Okay, we must have a conversation about Mulefe, clearly. But I have decided to just take it slow, because writing this book was extremely tiring. It's been rewarding having finished it and obviously looking out and seeing how many people turned up to my launch, this is really cool. But you know, the process of writing it is probably one of the most exhausting things I've ever done in my life. Like, I'm someone who like gyms, right? But like, I get way less tired from like an hour or two of gym than I do from writing a book. And to the point where when I finished this book, all I did was sleep. So I'm taking it very slow. I'm like, I was gonna enter short story competitions and I was like, no. So I do have an idea for another book, but I mean, we'll talk. I have an idea for a non-Mulifi related book right now, but I can't make any promises that it's going to be out next year or the year before, or the year after. I'm taking it slow. It'll be out when it's out. So that's what I'm working on.
Yeah, so I think that it would be remiss of us to, you know, not allow the audience to engage with you a little bit. So we'll take about let's see how it goes. Maybe let's start with 3 questions, and then we'll see how that goes.
Me too.
Hello. I just want to ask Naledi, how much research did you put into the characters? I mean, just in terms of understanding and knowing more about Christianity and perhaps other forms of information that you needed to actually make your characters and the story itself factual and not just based on personal experiences. And like you said, you're not necessarily a religious person and may not have intimate experiences with people like some other characters that you created. So how much research did you need to do in order to create such a beautiful story?
So the very first thing I did when I knew I was gonna, I got the Casalot's writer's residency, and the first thing I did before I went to the writer's residency was buy a Bible. It was the first Bible I bought in years. And and I spent a lot of time just reading it. So I do have a background, saying I have a background in Christianity, it sounds like I studied it. I grew up in the church and I was like confirmed, so I have that kind of background, but I also read the Bible and I watched a lot of pastors' sermons on like YouTube. And I wanted to go to a mega church just to see what it was like in there and like be able to believably write it. But then COVID happened. So I wrote a lot of what I did about the church from memory of the churches that I've been in. But that was the religious aspect. But in terms of some of the other characters, so there are 2 chapters in the book that take place in the 1980s in Soweto. So I interviewed people, like especially my mom, and not just my mom, but like a couple of people who lived in Soweto at the time, just to understand what it was like. I read a number of historical archives, and I just need to make this point that like the archives in this country are terrible. It is so difficult to find historical information on anything, but I did my best with that. I went to Soweto, I went to Alex, and also with Alex, what was interesting about Alex was that I found a master's thesis online that someone had done about masculinity in Alex, where they had followed boy children in Alex. It had been published in 2003, which is about the time that Solomon would have been a child. So it actually worked out perfectly for me. Where he just explored what it means to be a boy and to grow into a man, Alex. And ended up finding that an extremely useful source in writing Solomon. There was actually a lot more that I could have written, but then I had to remember that this is actually not Solomon's story. So a lot of it was relying on like traditional sources, like journals, articles, also interviews.
Any other question? Okay.
Naledi's writes a second book about Mulifi and Neil. Stay tuned to the Cheeky Latest, we'll let you know. But I'm really curious, because I think that will tell us a lot about, I guess, who you may relate to in the book, or who of yourself you might see in the book.
So some of the most difficult characters to write, so it's actually a tie. It's a tie between Solomon and Khiti for different reasons. So with Solomon, I was like, I need to believably show a descent, right? So properly show how he transitions from someone who has problematic aspects, but is not like necessarily a terrible person to a terrible person, right? And so showing that transition and making that transition for people was a bit challenging. One of the ways that I tried to do that was by showing his thought process. Because when someone does something that is wrong, you know, they might be a part of that knows that it's wrong, but then they justify it to themselves. So I needed to show Solomon justifying certain decisions that he makes to himself. Because there are decisions, he's a religious guy, but there are decisions he makes that are counter to his religion. And I kind of needed to show how he managed to justify that. And I also wanted to show that like people who do bad things don't necessarily, sometimes they're not aware that they're doing something bad, it's just that they feel they're justifying what they're doing. So trying to make Solomon believable from that standpoint for me was a bit of a challenge, but also Kheti. So the thing with Kheti is that she is not the world's most likable character. and when I wrote the first draft, she was worse.
What?
She was worse. So I was like, so I read the first draft and I was like, oh no, there was literally nothing to like about this girl. So I need to do something here. I need to try and find a way to humanize her. So one of the ways I decided to do this was by giving her a bit of a redemptive arc. I mean, it is a bit like too little too late, but it needed to be there. Because in the first draft, it didn't exist. And also I wanted to complicate her a bit more. So she's a character who routinely does terrible things and says terrible things. But
Very, very terrible.
like but I wanted to complicate it where she would say something terrible and there would be an awareness that she said something terrible and she would think to herself, I shouldn't have said that. But she's not going to do anything, she's not going to apologize because she's not that person. But I felt that it was important for her to have those moments in any case because those moments would kind of show that she was human and not just an awful cartoon. So I struggled a lot with her. I got to a point where she's still not likable, but I feel like there's some growth. I think there's a bit of growth there.
It's not that insecure gift, you know?
Growth.
But also, like, you think about, like, circumstance, right? I think often about, like, Kheti. Like, I hated her. Like, I was like, I want to have a couple of conversations with her. But I think, like, what is growth in the face of, like, things that are unchangeable, right? Kheti didn't grow because she woke up one day and grew conscious, right? Like, circumstances forced her to grow. So I thought that was an interesting commentary to be like how we come to the other side of it, right? So yes, maybe you might like her at the end of the book, but you're not liking her because she had an epiphany. You're liking her because life, you know, showed her some stuff.
Well, she kind of did have an epiphany.
No, she had an epiphany.
And also, I mean, there are people who, even in the face of circumstances, choose not to change. Right? So there is something to be said about being confronted with evidence that you really are a terrible person, and choosing to behave differently. Is the differently going to be perfect? I mean, Kheti is never going to be a great mother. Like, she will try, but it's just not within her. And maybe we need to think about what motherhood looks like, what being a good mother looks like when you're not ticking all the boxes of, like, being the mother who makes 2 sandwiches for your child and her friend and goes to all of her, like, activities at school.
She used to do Tato's homework, right? I'll give her that. I'm just like, actually, you did something nice. But like, Kheti, no. I want to talk about flowers for a bit. There's a lot of imagery in the book, right? Like dandelions are like a thing, right? Yeah. And I wonder, I think about, I don't know, now I'm going to show that I'm a superhero fanatic, but there's this Supergirl. She's Kara Zor-El from Krypton. And there's a scene in which she's died, you know, and she's like laying in a field of flowers. And so she regains her powers by the sun, and everything is in the sun, and so the flowers are like sunbeams for her. But I'm interested in like this imagery of dandelions. Why? What's that about?
So with the flowers, I kind of just, that was kind of just as I was going along, because I really like flowers. So I write a lot of references to nature in my writing, just because I think it's beautiful. But with the flowers, so with the so at the beginning of the book we have sunflowers, right? And that's the first moment where we have Tatu. And we must come back to Tatu because she's my favorite character. But we'll come back to her now.
All our favorite characters.
But so I wanted to have the imagery of the sunflower field because of the color yellow. So the color yellow features throughout the book quite prominently. And I wanted to have the sunflower field there because if you think about it, most of Tatu's the first moment when she realizes she has a certain power is connected to the color yellow. And yellow is ultimately connected to her aunt. So I wanted to create that visual link early on. But with the dandelions, again, that was another way of connecting her back to her aunt. And I've also just loved dandelions every time I'm a kid. They kind of feel like, because you make a wish, right? And then you blow them and you kind of feel hope that your wish might come true. So for me, dandelions have always been the symbol of hope. And it's all like symbolism and like color theory and like white being like purity, but also just, you know, the final scene in the book with the dandelions, which I can't go into detail because spoilers. But that final scene, that was the image I had in my mind. For me, that was like the last image I had of the book, and I was like, I have to end the book with this imagery because it's such a beautiful image, but it's also this like very powerful symbol in my head of hope, because I do end the book on quite a positive note.
Wow. Yeah, just from the Cheeky Natives to firstly congratulate you on what is a wonderful debut. I think that writing a book is a lot harder than people think it is. And there's something to be said about having written and had your debut published in the middle of a pandemic, right? And there's something to be said about writing a genre which is so unusual in contemporary writing in South Africa and doing it so well. And so it's really to give you your flowers from the Cheeky Natives, but also to give flowers to our audience as well. There's something so beautiful about seeing a room full of black people here to celebrate the launch of a young black woman's debut. And I think that every day we get our stories out there, we give power to our stories, and I think that, you know, for the next book that Naledi writes, it won't be surprising to us to see a room full of black people here to celebrate her work, and we can only hope that she grows from strength to strength in her writing, but also in sales. So,
thank you. A
so
room
yeah,
of black people who buy books.
yes, please, and who don't ask for PDFs of the author's book, who don't borrow a copy and don't return it. Please don't be responsible for depleting somebody's library. But it's really just to give Naledi all of the credit and to also thank our audience once again. And we look forward to all of the sales that we're going to see tonight. And you guys writing and tweeting and Instagramming and social mediaing about this book, because we really need to get books by young black authors out there and getting the kind of credits and media attention that they deserve. So once again, congratulations.
The sales station is at the back. I'm sure they're ready with, you know, the card machine, so if you want to go there.